1981, Portland, Oregon. The video game craze of the late 1970s and early 80s was one that was highlighted with hits such as Asteroids, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Galaxian, and Defender, and many more. Among these hits and instant classics in arcades across the United States, in Portland, Oregon, one of these cabinets stood out among the rest, and has solidified itself as a perplexing urban legend and mystery. One in which that involves addiction to the players who played it, government testing, and a possible tie-in to a formerly classified military experiment. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we venture into the early 1980s to uncover the truth about an arcade game like no other, Polybius. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and today's episode is definitely a fun one, and it contains a lot of what we normally talk about on this show, and that being mysteries, conspiracies, and overall just strange stories with no clear explanation behind them. Of course, we have talked about strange stories before, with me doing the Petscop episode quite a ways back, and that obviously tying into video games. And through my research on the internet, I found this story of Polybius, and I was fascinated by it. I was intrigued by the overall story and this idea that during the late 70s and early 80s, when the video game craze and arcade craze was at its prime, that a game with this much mystery and peculiarities behind it wasn't more widely known. So I wanted to take this story and tell it to you all this week and see if we can get to the bottom of the Polybius mystery and see if in fact this game ever really existed in the first place. So with that being said, how today's episode is going to work is that I'm going to give you all the story and the facts about the game Polybius, some evidence for or against it, and any other information and facts that I found in my research, and then discuss all of our possible theories that I have uncovered, and then at the very end, wrap it all up with my own personal thoughts on whether or not Polybius actually existed to begin with, or maybe in fact this is just some type of fancy hoax. Now, let's dive into the story of Polybius and the subsequent facts and info that we have about the game. For starters, like I established in the open, the video game craze of the 70s and the 80s had a massive grip on pop culture and society at the time, as kids of all ages flocked to arcades to play their newest favorite titles, like Pac-Man, Defender, Galaga, Galaxian, Space Invaders, Berserk, and other obscure and not as common titles. Now, it was a storm that was taking over the United States and pop culture itself. Now, as the legend of Polybius goes, in a sleepy suburb of Portland, Oregon, the arcade cabinet named Polybius appeared. Details about the game seem mysterious as its origins. It was supposedly a limited release with only a few cabinets ever being manufactured, and all of them were located in and around Portland, Oregon. Details about the game seem incredibly vague, with the cabinet not being particularly detailed, possibly being a very generic color with just the name Polybius across the top in block lettering. Nothing really sets Polybius apart from the endless mazes of flashing lights and colors of the arcades to begin with. Now, gameplay from Polybius isn't widely known as well, but is regarded as being fast-paced with action and puzzle elements. Kind of a combo between multiple different games, which kind of made it unique compared to others at that time that really only had one goal. Whether the arcade game was a puzzle game with a goal to complete said puzzle or to solve a riddle, or the other side being just to mindlessly blow up spaceships. Now, these games usually had one theme, not two, so that helped Polybius stand out from the rest. That is, according to legend. What is known about Polybius, even though its kind of details are shrouded in mystery, what seems to be widely known, like I mentioned, is that the players of the game had suffered addictive effects, as in, like they couldn't stop playing. Many flashing lights and strobing images are throughout the game, and those cause players to get disoriented, get migraines, sick to their stomach, and can cause other adverse health effects. However, this is only from written accounts, as any gameplay footage from the game Polybius has never been found. The only image we have that we can debunk on whether or not it is fake or whether it is real, we can't debunk it. We cannot chalk this image up to a hoax, and that being a title screen from the game. Now, the title screen has become synonymous with the story of Polybius, and it spells out the words Polybius in big light blue block font with the year 1981 at the bottom, accompanied by the name Sinislotion, which we can only assume is the developer of the game. Now, as suddenly as these Polybius cabinets appeared in the Portland suburbs, they also disappeared from these same arcades. And that kind of lends itself to the mystery and further establishes it as kind of like, why was it there? And then why was it not there all of a sudden? Now, this image of the title screen I will be sharing to my Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown when I post the cover art to this episode. I will be posting the title screen along with it, so you can have a better understanding of what I'm talking about when I am referring to the title screen. Now, the name of the game itself is worth noting, and the reason that is because the name Polybius is not just central to the game, but rather the name of two other things, one being the name of a famous Greek historian, and the other being the name of a cipher that translates numbers to letters as a sort of secret code, also known as the Polybius cipher. Now, of course, the more you know, and many people might be familiar with either of these two, but it is uncertain whether or not the creator of Polybius had either of these in mind when they created the game, or they merely just took that name maybe to make researching the game that much harder. Kinda. Nobody really has a clear consensus on why it is called Polybius, or what was the motive behind naming it Polybius. However, some people draw comparisons to the idea that Polybius also translates to many lives in Greek. Whether or not that has a tie in the game seems kind of vague, but again, the more you know. What is particularly interesting is, again, the next bit of text that we see on this title screen being the supposed game developer Sinislotion, which is actually a German word from what researchers have been able to find, and it actually loosely translates to erase senses, which is kind of eerie if you ask me, and kind of is a play on words in terms of similar to kind of the game's effect to those who played it, according to legend. And again, it is kind of uncertain if the name Sinislotion or the name of the company directly ties into the game or not, but we have to assume that, as, spoiler alert, unfortunately, the company, Sinislotion, does not actually exist. The developer is not credited with any game or is in any records of game development, so where did they come from? And who actually is Sinislotion? These are questions we don't fully know yet, but we'll possibly understand later on, so just keep that in mind. But let's keep talking about the title screen for a minute here. Like I mentioned, this is the only credited image of Polybius that we have. Again, no gameplay seems to exist. None that is canon to the original anyways. However, Polybius seems to be ahead of its time, as the title screen is very detailed for what was commonly out there for 1981. And that was because most of the games during the late 70s and the 80s were using all of their possible data to affect gameplay, not develop lavish title screen graphics. And we can see this with games such as Defender, Pac-Man, and Galaga. When the startup screen happens, the title is actually kind of really small, and sometimes a lot of the times in the center, and Polybius is an outlier. However, we can see later on in games like that come out in 1983 through 1985, these titles of those games that come out years after have more lavish titles, such as Nintendo. I believe Nintendo was the first ones to really have these lavish kind of eye-catching titles, and you see them in games such as Super Mario Bros., Pinball, and Duck Hunt that have these big elaborate titles. Now, the game developer Konami would also have these lavish titles come 1983 or so, and of course, you're like, why do the titles switch so much just in 2 years? Well, that's because every year of them developing these games, the developers would get better and better at making these games, of course, and would have more data and time to be able to spend on these, creating these large title screens to maybe better hook their audience and draw them to the game rather than the endless other mazes of arcade cabinets that are in any given arcade. Now, Polybius's title screen was out of character for the time period. Now, that is not saying that it couldn't have been done if Polybius is real, but if it is real, I should say, the screen is an outlier, and it sticks out like a sore thumb, comparable to those who were around in the same year. It almost seems like it is a few years too early for its time period. Now, the font itself on the title screen didn't match anything particular. Like, it didn't match a Sinislotion branded title, but we know Sinislotion as a company doesn't exist. But the name Sinislotion on the title screen appears in a font that is commonly associated with Williams branded arcade games, which again, you can just say that, oh, this Sinislotion, or whoever Sinislotion is, took the font that they liked from the Williams branded arcade games that was centric to Williams branded arcade games and put it on their game. Again, I don't know if there's copyright on text for arcade machines or anything like that, but it does cast doubt on the game's existence because of the copied font style. Again, I think the only thing that's missing between the Williams branded font and the Sinislotion font is that it has the two. I know there's a term for this, but I'm gonna sound really uneducated when I say this. But the two little dots above the O, there is the two little dots above the O in Sinislotion, which again the Williams branded font never had those. I don't feel like there was ever a word where they had to put those there. So again, that does not show up in the Williams branded font. But Sinislotion is a direct copy of this Williams branded font, which seems kind of weird considering a lot of different companies had different fonts that were specific to their games. So, not saying that they couldn't have not done that, but the copied font, again, does cast doubt on whether or not Polybius was real. But, again, I'm seeming awfully negative here. And are we sure that there is no gameplay out there? Now, that is kind of the question that everybody asks, and that might be the question that you're currently asking right now. Now, the website polybiuslives.com, which does not exist anymore, appeared on the internet around 2008, and it claimed to show glimpses of the game's gameplay and other images pulled from the game. However, like I said, that website does not exist anymore, and nothing about polybiuslives.com pointed towards these pictures and gameplay that they shared being genuine, and it was rather just some fan-made creation that we have to assume was made on the internet to stir around for clicks, and to be honest, that is all we get from this website. Now, Polybius seemed to gain a massive cult-like following, and this was kind of during the early 2000s, and it kind of seemed like many people were trying to get on the story at this time. Now, YouTube has videos of it, but it is most certainly all user-created, as interpretations of what the game might have actually been like. And there is no way to prove that any of these uploaded images and gameplay footage is actually real. And some of it doesn't even match up to what the game was described to have been like to play, so that can be immediately thrown out the window as well. Now, many people compare the gameplay of Polybius, or the supposed gameplay of Polybius, to be very similar to that as the arcade game Tempest. So a lot of people look to Tempest as an idea of what the game could have actually looked like, but again, there are no examples that we can find of actual Polybius gameplay, and the idea of the legend stating that there was only a few cabinets ever to exist kind of further doubts the idea that we might ever find gameplay to begin with, ever. Now, many other examples have been shared around the internet. Almost all of them are created, again, by other people and fans who are passionate about building tributes to the legend itself. Again, this evidence online is foggy at best. Many people have also claimed to have circuit boards, actual physical arcade cabinets, and even videos of people finding these cabinets out in abandoned places, and these are really just for clicks before the video kind of cuts out from these shaky kind of home video-esque type of videos. Again, this is kind of your blueprint for a hoax video, and as someone who often researches cryptids on this show, I've seen a lot of shaky hoax home videos from what people claim to be monsters when it's all just blurry and then the footage cuts out. These Polybius videos are exactly like that as well. And we have very little in terms of actual evidence and what's actually genuine gameplay. That seems to be non-existent for us to watch. And it challenges the legend's authenticity from the very beginning. And we aren't even into anything in regards to possible government involvement like I mentioned in the open. As the legend of Polybius states, the idea of the government being involved in some way, shape, or form is hotly contested within the legend and lore of Polybius. Now, members of the staff that worked in these Portland suburb arcades that contain the Polybius machines said that they witnessed quote-unquote men in black, or aka government agents, retrieving data from these machines after unsuspecting kids used them. Now, why would Men in Black want the game data from a bunch of kids and adolescents playing an arcade game is unknown. But the idea of the government being involved in arcades is not uncommon, because The FBI during this time period and during the height of the arcade craze was actively running their Winners Don't Do Drugs campaign on arcade game screens, as well as maybe busting the occasional arcade for unrelated circumstances. Now this and possibly MK Ultra could have influenced the idea of kind of this mind control harvesting data from these machines. Now if you were unfamiliar with what MK Ultra was, or if you'd never even heard of MK Ultra before, let me give you a brief little crash course. During the 1950s and early 1960s, the US government started MK Ultra, or Project MK Ultra as is also known, which at the time was a classified project that was testing CIA-backed mind control experiments and chemical interrogation techniques for wartime applications, and this was actually tested on citizens of the United States. Now that is very, very loaded, and a lot of people debate Project MK Ultra, and we know that this is real because MK Ultra got leaked, and then the government had to declassify this, and then say, oh hey, no, we actually did this. We're not saying it was okay, but we actually did this. So a lot of people point to MK Ultra today and say, oh, the government wouldn't do that. Oh, yes, they would. I think you've heard the meme from Wendigoon that's like, oh, the government would never do that. Oh, yes, they would. Same thing. People look at MK Ultra and it's like, okay, this is exactly the lengths of what the government would do to its own citizens that people don't know about, and that might be classified. And that's not even saying the other classified experiments that the government has probably conducted on U.S. citizens that we have no idea about. But MK Ultra is definitely the big one in terms of when people talk about government conspiracies and government cover-ups. Again, I could go all into this, but I will most likely cover MK Ultra in a future episode and talk about it in full detail, so we'll just leave you with that for now. But why would government agents be farming data from arcade machines in the suburbs of Portland? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But let's talk more about some evidence here. The most convincing piece of evidence that we could have, or possibly could have, or one of the more convincing pieces of evidence that we have that lends itself to the Polybius legend being real and just existing in general, is that of a man named Stephen Roach. Now, in 2006, Stephen went online to a site called coinop.org and made a post claiming that he set up Sinislotion with other programmers and was primarily based in the Czech Republic, and that the company was founded in 1978. Stephen goes on to say that they were approached by a South American company that wanted to design a game and launch it in a very small North American market. Now, whether or not the claims that Stephen Roach is making could be proven is a whole nother thing. Now, he continues in saying after developing the game and including it with all this flashy imagery and what could only be described as addictive properties, the game was put in the Portland, Oregon market. Stephen would go on to say in future interviews that they wanted to take the game a step further from what the norm was at the time, which was pretty much like you in a little spaceship killing waves after waves of other alien spaceships. Stephen wanted to incorporate a puzzle-like approach so that it seemed like the player had to make some thoughts and decisions while playing the game. However, it seems more than likely than not, the quote-unquote Stephen Roach persona is a fake one, and that this was a character created by someone to join in on the ruse and take it multiple steps further than ever before. In a 2015 article written by Kat Despira, she investigated the Stephen Roach persona further and found that someone in the Czech Republic with the name Stephen Roach. However, they were a former police officer from Utah that was working in a troubled youth facility and was in no way, shape, or form a game developer. Stephen's style of writing in his posts is also not grammatically correct and full of numerous errors. Interviews that Stephen did with other gaming websites are just him responding to emails. They're not actually physical emails or, what we would consider like a Zoom call now or a phone interview. They were pretty much just email interviews of going back and forth. So we never see Stephen's face. We never actually meet Stephen. There's no example of Stephen actually existing. And it seems more or less like an alias. And in these interviews he did with these other gaming websites, Stephen doesn't really add anything additional to this story. He merely just kind of repeats it over and over again from what he originally posted on the coinop.org website. This idea of Stephen Roach and the story of him just doesn't make much sense. And unfortunately, this is another dead end, it seems. Now, to me, even though this legend starts in the 1980s, 1981 to be specific, it seems very based in the internet. And that mostly being because the story didn't really hit mainstream until 2003 and 2004, when the story of Polybius made an appearance in the popular gaming magazine called GamePro. Now, because of this magazine being as popular as it was in the early 2000s, many people started talking about Polybius and spreading this legend, but that's not the first time that it was mentioned on the internet either. On the same website that Stephen Roach commented on, coinop.org, and I neglected to mention what coinop.org actually was the first time I mentioned it, but coinop.org is a website used to share and discuss these old arcade games, and it mostly contains people talking about these games, talking about times that they had played them, and obviously collectors frequent the site very, very frequently because they're looking for rare and unusual arcade games because, of course, rarer the game, the more money they can possibly make by acquiring that game cabinet. Now, on this coinop.org website, the first mention of Polybius was actually on its site, as it mentioned a game page for it was created on August 3rd, 1998, which predates the GamePro article. So we have a date, even though it's not close to 1981, which again, further casts doubt that this story is even real. Now, it is possible that the idea of Polybius could have surfaced before 1998 on the internet, but that seems like a long shot, and it seems like this is a mainstream starting point for the legend, and it calls into question the whole story and the authenticity of this coinop.org site and their role in the legend to begin with. Now, again, coinop.org, like I said, used very frequently by collectors, kind of has like a message board, forum type of element. If you go on coinop.org, it's still up now, but it looks like it has not been updated in a very long time, probably upwards of over 10 years now it hasn't been updated. So you load up the site and it looks very, very dated. Now, of course, the common thread between all of this, between the GamePro article in 2003 to 2004, seems to have gotten its information from the 1998 article in coinop.org. Stephen Roach goes on to coinop.org to say his entire story. It seems like the one focal point in this story just happens to be coinop.org. Now, it seems like they are the earliest mention of the Polybius name on the internet, and the man responsible for coinop.org was a man named Kurt Kohler. Now, perhaps Kurt got inspiration from a variety of factors to help build and establish this far-fetched story, and once the idea of this Polybius machine and the government harvesting data from children and it making kids sick, once that story became mainstream, it let the newly formed internet do its thing with the story. Now, it is the most likely responsible party that we have, that being coinop.org and Kurt Kohler, which, again, coinop.org is still up. You can still go to the Polybius kind of section of coinop.org. You can just look up Polybius on coinop.org, and it will show the game details. And it lists Polybius, and it describes it with the following. I'm going to read the actual excerpt from the coinop.org website. And it says, and I quote, "This game had a very limited release, 1 or 2 backwater arcades in a suburb of Portland. The history of this game is cloudy. There were all kinds of strange stories about how kids who played it got amnesia afterwards, couldn't remember their name, or where they lived, etc. The bizarre rumors about this game are that it was supposedly developed by some kind of weird military tech offshoot group, used some kind of proprietary behavior modification algorithms developed for the CIA or something. Kids who played it woke up at night screaming, having horrible nightmares. According to an operator who ran an arcade with one of these games, guys in black coats would come to collect quote-unquote records from the machines. They're not interested in quarters or anything. They just collected information about how the game was played. The game was weird looking, kind of abstract, fast action with some puzzle elements. The kids who played it stopped playing games entirely. One of them became a big anti-video game crusader or something. We've contacted one person who met him, and he claims the machines disappeared after a month or so, and no one ever heard about them again. Until the ROM showed up. Here's what we found so far. Found English strings, quote-unquote, insert coin, and quote-unquote, press 1 player start, and quote-unquote, only looks like 1 or 2 player game. Text in the game says C, copyright, 1981 Cineslotion, maybe a German company? If anyone has heard any additional information about this game, we appreciate hearing about it. Quick update. We just wanted to go on record here that Stephen Roach is full of himself and knows nothing about this game. We have it on good authority. No, Polybius is not a Tempest prototype. No, Polybius is not a vector game. Does the title screen look vector? No, it does not. We've recently received some new information about the game. Today's May 16th, 2009. And yes, one of us is flying to the Kiev, Ukraine area tomorrow, and yes, the trip is related to this information. Stay tuned. Close quote. There is no further updates after this kind of post that coinop.org added to the Polybius section. So it's kind of uncertain whether or not that they actually went to Kiev, Ukraine to investigate the Polybius legend. That seems very vague. Like I said, there's no updates. It doesn't seem like there's any other updates in the comment section of the coinop.org game details page either. And since coinop.org is the earliest known mention of the game, it does make sense that they could be the likely culprit at work here, and of course made up the entire story in order to drive traffic to the coinop.org website, maybe perhaps to make some type of profit off the story. However, this kind of leads us to a point and a time in the episode where I would lead you into theories. But to be honest, I think we only have one theory, and that is the one we've been setting up pretty much the whole episode. And that this is a setup done by coinop.org and Kurt Kohler to make a quick buck, and that the story itself is full of quote-unquote supposed statements. You know, he said, she said elements. It's really impossible to distinguish what's fact from what's fiction. The title screen of Polybius could have been fabricated by Kurt Kohler to go along with the story of the game. And that is why that's the only picture that we have from the game that cannot be debunked. Now, the stories of kids getting sicknesses from the game was something that was commonly associated with other arcade games. This was not unheard of, and this was not a Polybius exclusive phenomenon. Sickness while playing these arcade games was, again, not uncommon, mostly due to these marathon play sessions that kids would partake in these arcades in the constant pursuit of a new record or personal best. One popular example was actually in Portland, Oregon, when a young boy fled an arcade in a hurry because of stomach discomfort and nausea because of a 28-hour marathon playing the game Asteroids, which is just crazy. Now, adding on top of that, there has even been one death that we know of that has been associated through the use of these arcade games, and that was in 1982. Now, Peter Bukowski of Illinois is credited as the only death due to video games after he was playing the arcade game Berserk and died at the cabinet due to a pre-existing heart condition, not the game. However, it is speculated that the game and its flashing lights and stress of the game worsened his heart condition and ultimately contributed to him passing away, and he was only 18 years old. To top this all off, seizures and photosensitivity wasn't fully understood back in the 80s, and this was before many of these games had warning labels and that they were kind of introduced to a lot of things. And a lot of people would fall victim to these seizures because they didn't understand that they had a sensitivity to these flashing lights or these flashing images. And this, again, this wasn't exclusive to Polybius. This was pretty much every single arcade game. Kids were getting sick. Kids were falling victim to photosensitivity issues. This was not just central to Polybius. These weren't just central issues that Polybius had. This was a widespread arcade phenomenon. And again, it doesn't really contribute to the legend because it's solely just, it's every arcade game. Now, many things that were reported about the game and spread with the story seemed nothing more than normal, all things considered. Especially when you take into account that other games were doing this to kids as well. Now, you kind of got my theory on who I think it is, and that being coinop.org and Kurt Kohler being responsible. But here's some more of my personal thoughts. It seems to me like the story of Polybius was influenced through a variety of factors, most likely through the work of Kurt Kohler, like I mentioned, although we will never know that for certain. It seems more than likely he fabricated the story to draw traffic to the coinop.org website, and from there people started talking about the story and then possibly sent a tip in to GamePro magazine and so on and so forth, and the story spread from there. Now, I have talked about internet legends before, and the idea of the internet playing this elaborate game of telephone I fully support, because everyone wants to be a part of the story at the end of the day. And I also think that is what's happened here. and caused many people to create fake gameplay or videos saying that they had found a cabinet, when in reality, it was all fake. There unfortunately is no evidence linking Polybius to being real, and if you want a deeper dive than what I gave today, check out Ahoy's video on YouTube. Now, I did source him for some of this information, as he did give the most comprehensive breakdown I have ever seen on this topic and went in incredible detail. And from my research, he seemed to be the only one to link Kurt Kohler to being the most likely suspect behind the case of Polybius, and that is why I am using him as my most likely candidate. He seems to be the only candidate that is presented in any of the sources that I found, as a lot of people kind of just chalk this up to a fake urban legend thing and don't really list anybody as a primary suspect. Now, I do think Kurt Kohler is the most likely suspect behind the case of Polybius, and there are plenty of other video game legends and stories out there. But in the case of Polybius, this seems to be a flat-out hoax, unfortunately. And to build on that, the possibility that this game was some kind of MK Ultra-esque experiment on America's youth is compelling. I'm not going to lie. That is a very interesting part of the story. However, MK Ultra took place in the 1950s to the 1960s. The idea that the projects could be associated with each other is very, very low. If you go with the idea that the cabinet existed in the first place, and you want to say, hey, this is not a hoax, it existed, and that the Men in Black or the CIA or the US government was farming data from these machines, and that's the route you want to go with, and that's the route you believe, wouldn't have more people at these arcades seen these supposed Men in Black? And why wouldn't these Men in Black or government agents try and blend in as normal game mechanics if they were trying to remain discreet? If this, in fact, whole story is real, and these operators at these arcades said that they saw Men in Black coats come in and, take this data from the machine, you would think that if they were government agents and they were taking this data for use by the U.S. government, that they would try and remain discreet, and that just doesn't seem like that's being told in the story. It seems like they're using the buzzword of Men in Black to spread further lore and legend about the story, and it just doesn't make sense. And this part of the story with the Men in Black and people associating it with MK Ultra just does not make sense, and it just has way too many holes in it for me to take this part of it seriously. And it is unfortunate, because overall, Polybius is a great story from a crazy time in American pop culture. However, through my research and through my own personal opinion, there is no merit to support Polybius's existence pretty much at all. Which is unfortunate, because Polybius has entered itself into kind of pop culture even further. We see a lot of references throughout television, through other video games, things of that nature. We have seen it. It has kind of taken a life of its own, and that is mostly because of the internet. The internet does crazy things to these urban legends, and again, I think that is part of what helped spread the legend of Polybius to begin with, even though I just have a very hard time of thinking it even existed to begin with. But with that being said, I know it is not the fun outcome, I guess, in terms of topic and in terms of story. It kind of seems, again, another hoax on our hands. But again, I felt like this one was very fun for me to research. I learned a lot about it, a lot about conspiracies, a lot about cover-ups. When you talk about the U.S. government and cover-ups, it always gets a little fun. But of course, that's just my personal opinion. But I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown over Polybius. I hope to keep covering these kind of mystery, kind of internet mysteries, and also kind of video game mysteries as well, because, again, I'm kind of a little bit of a closeted gamer myself. So these are very fun. They're very interesting for me to do, and kind of a little bit different in comparison to what I normally cover, that being kind of mystery, missing people, death, monsters, a little bit of a lighthearted kind of mystery vibe to add into kind of the very dark topics I sometimes discuss. So yeah, we used the Polybius to break it up this week and get a little more positive. I mean, last week we were talking about everybody in the Kennedy family dying, so we broke it up a little bit this week with a very fun and different topic. But again, I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown. If you are listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. Should be every Tuesdays. Those are the days that I hope to put out new episodes, and if that changes at all, I will let you folks know. If you are listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe to my channel. It helps me out greatly, and I appreciate everything you folks do for me. If you leave a comment on my video, I do try and respond to them as much as I can, especially if you ask me a question or anything like that. I do try and get to them as quickly as I possibly can, so there is that as well. I am also on TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown, where I post 1-minute breakdowns of every episode that I do. There was a couple episodes in there that I missed quite a bit. I'm trying to stay active on TikTok as much as I can because I know TikTok reaches a very, very broad audience. But I'm also on TikTok if you want to go and follow me there. Follow me on Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown, where, of course, I'll post the cover art and the title screen of Polybius that has not been debunked. I will be posting that both on my Instagram when this episode comes out. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode, and I will see you all on the next one.